The contract said convenience. It said temporary. It said no emotional entanglements, no personal questions, no crossed boundaries. I had read every line of it twice, then a third time under the pale light of a single candle in my small room at the edge of the Thornvale Pack's territory, my finger tracing each cold word as if repetition could make them feel less like a cage being locked around my ribs. I had signed it anyway. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I stood in the grand entrance hall of Ironhold Keep, the seat of the Alpha King's power, a fortress carved from dark stone and older ambition, wearing a dress that didn't belong to me, in a life that didn't belong to me, waiting for a man who had never once looked at me like I was a person, rather than a solution. The hall smelled of pine resin and cold iron. Torches lined the walls in iron brackets, their flames throwing restless shadows across the stone floor, and somewhere deep in the keep, a door closed with the kind of weight that traveled through walls. I felt it in my sternum. "You're just here to stabilize the alliance," I reminded myself. Nothing more. Finish the year, walk away, go back to your invisible life in Thornvale where no one expects anything from you anyway. Being invisible had always been my particular talent. I was 23 years old, an Omega from a minor pack on the eastern border. Not powerful, not remarkable, not the kind of woman anyone wrote stories about. My hair was pale blonde, always slightly escaping whatever I tried to do with it, and my eyes were the unremarkable gray-green of winter moss. I was not the kind of woman who married kings. I was the kind of woman who organized supply records and went unnoticed at pack gatherings and never, ever caused problems, which was precisely why Elder Doran had chosen me. "You won't complicate things," he had said, folding his hands on his desk with the calm satisfaction of a man who had already decided. "You're sensible, quiet. You won't fall in love with him, and you certainly won't embarrass us. 1 year of marriage in name only. Cassian needs a queen figure to silence the northern lords who keep questioning his legitimacy, and we need his military protection. It's a simple arrangement." Simple, right. Nothing about Ironhold Keep was simple. Nothing about the way the wolves here moved, with that coiled, deliberate power, always watching, always measuring, was simple. And nothing about Cassian of the Iron Throne was even remotely close to simple. I heard him before I saw him. Not his voice. He wasn't speaking. It was the shift in the room itself, the way every wolf in the entrance hall seemed to recalibrate, spines straightening, chins lifting, the collective held breath of people in the presence of something they both respected and feared. I turned slowly, because some instinct told me that turning quickly would feel like flinching, and I refused to flinch in the first 10 seconds. He came down the main staircase with the particular, unhurried pace of someone who had never once in his life needed to rush, because the world simply waited for him. He was enormous. Not just tall, but built. Braided dark hair falling past his shoulders, ice blue eyes that caught the torchlight and reflected nothing warm back. He wore his leather armor like a second skin, the dark material crossed with buckled straps across his chest, a fur mantle over his shoulders that made him look like something out of a legend that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be a warning or a promise. He stopped at the base of the stairs. He looked at me. The room held its breath. I had prepared for cold indifference. I had prepared for dismissal. For the particular way powerful men looked through women like me, as if we were made of glass too thin to bother with. I had not prepared for the way Cassian's blue eyes settled on my face, with something that wasn't warmth, wasn't even interest exactly, but was intensely, uncomfortably present. Like he was actually seeing me. Like he was cataloging me, filing me somewhere in that unreadable mind, deciding something I hadn't been asked about. He said nothing. I said nothing. His second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Rael, who had met me at the gates and spoken in that careful tone people use with things they consider fragile, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "My king, Yurkon, the Lady Penny, of Thornvale Pack, as arranged." Cassian's gaze didn't move from my face. I know who she is." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. I felt it somewhere behind my teeth. "Lady Penny." He descended the last step. Up close, he was even more arresting. There was a thin scar cutting through the left side of his jaw, barely visible, and his eyes were not simply blue but something closer to the color of deep winter sky at midday, when the cold is so clean it almost looks like warmth but isn't. "I trust your journey was acceptable." Acceptable. Not pleasant, not comfortable. Acceptable. "It was fine," I said, because I had promised myself I would not be meek, would not stammer, would not give this place any more power over me than it already had. "Thank you." Something moved across his expression, gone before I could name it. "Good." He turned to Rael. "Show her to the Queen's chambers. The formal presentation to the council is tomorrow at midday." He was already moving away, back toward the corridor that led deeper into the keep, and I watched his retreating back with the distinct sensation of having been assessed and temporarily filed away, like a document he intended to review later when he had more time. I should have felt relieved. I didn't. Rael led me up the east staircase, through corridors lit by sconces and lined with tapestries, wolves and battles, and the sigil of the Iron Throne, a crown wreathed in thorns, to a set of heavy oak doors that opened into a room that stopped me in the doorway. It was large and dark-toned, furnished in deep burgundy and charcoal gray, the stone walls softened by layered rugs and shelves of books that looked genuinely read rather than decorative. A fireplace crackled along the north wall, and beside it, a small writing table already held an inkset and a stack of blank parchment, as if someone had anticipated that I might need somewhere quiet to think. I didn't know why that detail unraveled something in my chest. "The king's chambers are through that door," Rael said carefully, nodding at a second door on the interior wall. "It locks from both sides. He wanted you to know that." I looked at the door. Heavy oak, iron handle, a bolt I could throw from my side. He wanted you to know that. Meaning Cassian had thought, in the middle of whatever enormous political machinery he ran, to make sure I knew I had a lock. That was not indifference. Indifference didn't bother with locks. "Thank you, Rael," I said quietly. He nodded and withdrew, and I was alone in the Queen's chambers of Ironhold Keep. In a life built from ink and strategy and mutual benefit, wearing a dress that didn't belong to me, listening to the fire breathe. I crossed to the window. Below, the keep's inner courtyard was visible. Torches, wolves moving in pairs, the distant smell of pine forest beyond the walls. Cold air seeped through the stone around the glass. I pressed my fingertips to the window's edge and felt the chill move up my arms. 1 year, I told myself. 12 months. You've survived worse with less. That was true. What was also true, what I would only admit in the privacy of my own skull, in the dark, with no witnesses, was that when Cassian's blue eyes had settled on my face at the foot of those stairs, something in my chest had gone very, very still. Not fear. I knew fear. Fear was loud and jangled, a frantic thing. This was its opposite. This was the particular, dangerous stillness of a compass needle finding north. I stepped away from the window. I threw the bolt on the connecting door. And then I sat on the edge of the bed that wasn't mine, in the keep that wasn't mine, married to a king who didn't want a wife. And I told myself firmly that stillness meant nothing, that I was sensible, that I was quiet, that I did not fall in love with kings. Somewhere on the other side of that bolted door, I heard him, not his voice, just the quiet sound of footsteps crossing stone, then stopping. A pause, and then nothing. But the pause lasted just a little too long. The council presentation was held in the Great Hall at midday, and I learned very quickly that midday in Ironhold Keep meant something different than it did anywhere else I had ever lived. In Thornvale, Midday was the smell of bread from the communal kitchen, the sound of children in the yard, wolves coming in from patrol with mud on their boots, and easy conversation on their lips. It was ordinary, and warm, and utterly without ceremony. Here, midday was 47 wolves in formal positions around a table carved from a single slab of dark oak, their eyes tracking my every step from the moment I entered the hall until the moment I stopped beside Cassian's chair and remembered to breathe. Rael had prepared me as best he could that morning, appearing at my door with a tray of tea and a look that suggested he understood exactly how overwhelming this would be, and felt genuinely bad about it. He had names for me. Lord Fenwick of the Northern Reaches, sharp-eyed and silver-haired, who had been the loudest voice questioning Cassian's right to rule without a bonded queen. Lady Soren of the Western Coast, young and beautiful and watchful, who had apparently been considered a potential match for Cassian herself once. Commander Dax, head of the Iron Guard, who trusted no one by default and considered that a professional virtue. "Just stand straight and don't show them anything," Rael had said, refilling my cup. "They're looking for cracks. Don't give them any." I had wanted to ask him how he managed to be both the king's second in command and the only person in this fortress who spoke to me like I was a human being, but I had filed that question away for later. There would be time for understanding Rael. First, I had to survive the council. I stood straight. I showed them nothing. Cassian introduced me in that same low, even voice. Lady Penny of Thornvale. Bound to the Iron Throne by the rights of alliance marriage, recognized by this council as queen of these territories for the duration of her tenure. And I watched 47 wolves process that sentence with varying degrees of acceptance and skepticism. Lord Fenwick's pale eyes moved from Cassian's face to mine, and back again with the particular calculation of a man trying to find the seam where the performance began. I met his gaze and held it. He looked away first. It surprised us both, I think. What I had not anticipated was that Cassian would stand close enough during the presentation that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. That particular heat that powerful wolves carried like a second skin. He didn't touch me. We had agreed there would be minimal contact, that the performance would be subtle rather than theatrical. But he was close enough that when he turned his head slightly to address a question from the far end of the table, I caught the scent of him. Cedar and cold air and something mineral, like stone after rain. I filed that away too, in the section of my mind labeled things that are not useful to notice. The council lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, my back ached from standing rigid, and my smile, the calm, neutral expression I had constructed for the occasion, felt carved into my face. When Cassian finally said, "This council is adjourned," I exhaled so slowly that no one could have heard it. No one except, apparently, him. As the wolves filed out around us, he turned and looked at me with that same direct, cataloging attention from the night before. "You held up well," he said. Not a compliment exactly. More like an observation, the way someone might note that a bridge bore the weight of traffic without incident. "Thank you," I said, because I didn't know what else to do with it. He studied my face for a moment. "Fenwick will test you again. He tests everything. Don't take it personally." "I don't take things personally," I said. "It's inefficient." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I wasn't sure Cassian did smiles, but a flicker of something that hadn't been there a moment before. It lasted less than a second. "Good," he said, and walked away. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected. I had imagined the fake marriage as a kind of elegant isolation. Separate rooms, separate schedules, the occasional formal appearance, and then long stretches of polite mutual avoidance. What I had not imagined was the keep itself, and how alive it was, and how quickly it began pulling me in. It was Mara who undid my careful distance first. Mara was the keep's head archivist, a small, sharp-boned woman somewhere in her 50s with ink-stained fingers and the aggressive organizational energy of someone who had single-handedly cataloged 3 centuries of pack records and considered it a personal achievement. She appeared at my chamber door on my 3rd morning with an armful of bound ledgers and a look that suggested she had already decided I would be useful. The previous queen, the one before the arrangement, the king's mother, she maintained the historical records of the outer territories, Mara said, depositing the ledgers on my writing table without asking. No one has touched them in 4 years. I thought perhaps... She paused, assessing me with bright, unsentimental eyes. Rael said you managed supply records for Thornvale. For 6 years, I said. Her expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction. Good. Then you won't find these intimidating. I didn't find them intimidating. I found them fascinating. Centuries of territorial maps, alliance records, dispute resolutions, crop yields and migration patterns, and the careful, meticulous accounting of a kingdom that was far more complex than its stone walls suggested. I started spending mornings in the archive with Mara. And Mara, once she had decided I was competent, turned out to be the most straightforwardly honest person in the entire keep. She said what she thought. She explained things without condescension, and she talked about Cassian the way no one else did. Not with reverence or fear or political calculation, but with the particular frankness of someone who had known him since he was a boy. He wasn't always like this, she said one afternoon, not looking up from the ledger she was repairing. The silence, the distance, that came later, after Aaron. I kept my eyes on my own work. Who was Aaron? A pause. His bonded mate. She was taken by the Valen faction 7 years ago. He never... Mara smoothed the ledger's spine carefully. He never found her. He had to accept eventually that she was gone. And then he sealed everything off and became what you see now. The archive felt quieter after that. I thought about the bolted door between our rooms. I thought about the way he had made sure I knew the lock was there. I thought about a man who had loved someone and lost her, and then built walls so efficient that even his own wolves couldn't find the seams. I didn't say anything to Mara, but something in my chest ached quietly for the rest of the afternoon, and I let it, because I was alone and no one was watching, and sometimes the truth needed a few minutes before you could file it away. 3 weeks into my tenure, the trouble started. It came in the form of a letter, delivered to the council table during morning review. A formal communique from the Valen faction's new representative, Lord Caedmon, requesting a summit at the northern border within the month. The stated purpose was trade renegotiation. The unstated purpose, according to Rael's tight expression as he read it aloud, was to assess whether the alliance marriage was genuine or a political fabrication. They have sources inside the keep, Rael said carefully, setting the letter down. The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant everyone was thinking something no one wanted to say first. Cassian sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the dark oak, looking at the letter with an expression that revealed nothing. Then he looked at me, directly, across the length of the table. "They'll want to see us together," he said, convincingly. "How convincingly?" I asked, and I was proud of how even my voice came out. "As if this is real," he said, simple, direct, and somehow in that plainness, more unsettling than any elaborate explanation could have been. Lord Fenwick, seated to Cassian's left, made a sound that might have been a scoff poorly disguised as a cough. "With respect, my king, Lady Penny is an Omega from a minor pack with no formal training in diplomatic performance. The Valen representatives will see through." "They won't," Cassian said. He hadn't looked away from me. "She held this council without flinching on her first day. She'll manage Caedmon." The confidence in his voice was so matter-of-fact, so utterly without qualification, that it took me a moment to understand it was directed at me. Not performed for the room, not political calculation. He simply believed it. I looked back at him across that long table, in that room full of wolves who had already decided what I was and what I was worth, and I felt the compass needle in my chest swing north again, steadier this time, more certain, and far more difficult to ignore. "I'll manage, Kedman," I confirmed. Fenwick said nothing more, but the look he gave me as the council dissolved was the look of a man recalculating, and I filed that away too. Because in a keep full of walls and locked doors and people who never said what they meant, information was the only currency I had. The summit was 3 weeks away, and Cassian decided we needed to practice. I found out about this the way I was learning. I found out about most things in Ironhold Keep. Not through direct communication, but through Rael appearing at my door with that careful expression he wore when delivering news he wasn't entirely sure how I would receive. "The king requests your presence in the East Study this evening," he said. "After the evening meal, he wants to..." A pause. "Establish parameters." "Parameters," I repeated, "for the summit, the performance." He made a list. Of course he had made a list. Cassian struck me as a man who had made lists since childhood, who found comfort in the clear delineation of expectations and outcomes, who trusted words on parchment more than the complicated and unreliable territory of spoken intention. Which meant we had more in common than I was comfortable admitting. The East Study was smaller than I had expected. Not a formal room, but a working one. The desk buried under maps and dispatches. 2 chairs angled toward the fireplace. A half-empty cup of something dark and cooling on the mantel. It smelled like him in here. Cedar and cold, and that mineral quality I kept noticing and kept telling myself was irrelevant. He was standing at the window when I arrived, looking out at the dark courtyard below, and he didn't turn immediately. I stood just inside the doorway and waited, because I had learned that Cassian's silences were not empty. They were occupied, full of something he was working through, and interrupting them was like stepping into a sentence before it was finished. He turned after a moment. He had removed the fur mantle, wearing only the leather armor and the harness of straps across his chest, and without the mantle's additional mass, he looked somehow both less imposing and more human. The scar along his jaw caught the firelight. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He didn't, not yet. He moved to the desk and picked up a folded sheet of parchment, brought it to the chair opposite mine, and finally settled into it, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body always seemed slightly too large for ordinary furniture. He unfolded the parchment. "The Valen representatives will observe us over 2 days. Meals together, a formal reception on the second evening, possibly a joint address to the Border Council." He looked up. "They will be watching for inconsistency. Small things, whether we occupy the same space comfortably, whether our attention tracks each other naturally, whether there are gaps." "Gaps," I said. "Moments where the performance shows." His blue eyes were very steady. "Real couples have a specific kind of attention to each other, not constant, not theatrical, just present, an awareness. We need to replicate that." I looked at him across the firelit space between our chairs and thought about the word replicate, about the clinical distance it tried to establish around something that was, at its core, deeply and inconveniently human. "So we practice being aware of each other," I said. "Yes." "And your list covers what exactly? How close to stand? Whether to use your name?" "All of it." He held out the parchment. I took it. The list was precise and thorough, written in a hand that was surprisingly clean for someone who spent his days with maps and battle plans, physical proximity parameters, forms of address, Cassian in private, my king only in formal address, agreed personal details to share if questioned, how we met, what drew us together, the shape of a courtship that had never happened. At the bottom of the list, a single line that I read twice. "If contact becomes necessary, follow her lead." I lowered the parchment. He was watching me with that quiet, measuring attention. "You wrote that I should lead," I said. "You're the one who decides what's comfortable," he said, as if it were obvious. As if powerful men routinely deferred to Omega, women from minor packs on questions of personal boundary. "I won't put you in a position you didn't choose." The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the courtyard and pressed briefly against the window glass. I thought about Elder Doran, who had told me what I would do and called it simple. I thought about every room I had sat in, where my comfort had been the last consideration on anyone's list. I folded the parchment carefully. "All right," I said. "Let's practice." We met in the East Study every evening for the following week. It was strange at first, two people learning each other with the specific self-consciousness of actors rehearsing, hyper-aware of every gesture and pause. Cassian was not naturally demonstrative. He occupied space with the contained precision of someone who had learned long ago that too much movement telegraphed vulnerability, and the idea of softening that, of letting someone close, even for performance, visibly cost him something. But he tried. That was what undid me, slowly, over those evenings. He tried. He would sit beside me on the study's small settee and practice the particular posture of a man at ease with his wife's proximity, shoulder angled toward mine, not touching, but inclined. He practiced saying my name without the formal distance he used for everyone else, just Penny, 2 syllables in that low voice, and the third time he said it, something in my chest made a sound I chose not to examine. I learned things I hadn't been meant to learn. That when he was thinking deeply, he pressed 2 fingers against the scar on his jaw, not touching it, just near it, as if checking that it was still there. That he had read most of the books in the East Study and had opinions about all of them. Quiet and specific opinions he offered in the careful way of someone who wasn't sure his thoughts were worth offering. That he slept badly. I knew this because I was a light sleeper myself, and through the bolted door between our rooms, I would sometimes hear, in the deep hours of the night, the quiet sound of him moving, pacing, the creak of the chair at his desk, when he gave up on sleep entirely. I mentioned it once, obliquely. "Do you always work this late?" And something crossed his face that was quick and almost startled, as if I had seen something he'd forgotten to hide. "Old habit," he said. I didn't push. But I thought about Mara's words. About Aaron. About a man who had closed everything off and become what he needed to be, and stopped sleeping properly somewhere in the process, and had been that way for 7 years. Rael noticed the shift in things before I did, the way good second-in-commands always notice before anyone admits anything out loud. He didn't say so directly. Rael was too careful for that. But one afternoon in the corridor, falling into step beside me on my way to the archive, he said quietly, "You're good for him. The evenings. He's..." A pause. "He comes to morning briefings less like a man who spent the night at war with himself." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing. But I kept it, filed it somewhere that wasn't the section labeled things that are not useful to notice, because that section was getting crowded and I was running out of space. The evening before we left for the Northern Border Summit, something changed. We were in the East Study, later than usual, going through the agreed personal details one final time. The shape of the courtship that hadn't happened. The answers to questions Keedman's people would certainly ask. It was well past midnight. The fire burned low, and I was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been performing composure for weeks without adequate rest. I made a mistake, not a large one. I misremembered a detail, said we had first met at the midsummer gathering when the agreed story placed it at a territorial review. And Cassian corrected me gently, and I pressed my fingers to my eyes and said, more honestly than I'd intended, "I'm sorry. I'm tired. I keep losing track of what's real." The room went quiet. I dropped my hands. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the cataloging attention, not the measured assessment. Something that was quieter than those things and went deeper. An expression that didn't have a strategic purpose. "What would be real?" he asked, very quietly, like he was asking himself as much as me. I should have said something careful, something that kept the careful walls exactly where we'd built them. Instead, I looked at him, at the blue eyes in the firelight, at the scar and the dark braids and the set of his jaw that always looked like it was holding something in. And I told him the truth. "I don't know anymore," I said, "and that frightens me more than anything in this keep." He was still for a long moment. Then he reached out and very slowly covered my hand where it rested on the armrest between our chairs. Not gripping, not claiming, just the warm weight of his palm over my fingers, a contact so careful it felt like a question still waiting for an answer. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved, and the fire burned lower, and outside the wind pressed against the glass, and the wall between practice and real developed a crack. Neither of us mentioned out loud, though we both, I was certain, felt it running all the way through. The northern border looked nothing like the rest of Cassian's territory. Where Ironhold Keep was dark stone and contained power, the border settlement of Greyvale was all open sky and wind-stripped trees, a cluster of long buildings pressed against a ridge of pale rock as if sheltering from something that hadn't arrived yet, but was expected. The air here tasted different, sharper, with a mineral edge that reminded me of the moment before a storm decides to commit. We arrived in the late afternoon, 2 days before the summit, and I stood in the courtyard of the border garrison and let the wind pull at the loose strands of my blonde braid and thought, this is where things will either hold or fall apart. Cassian rode in beside me. We had made the journey on horseback, a practical decision that had the secondary effect of forcing hours of proximity without the structured container of the East Study's walls. He was a different kind of quiet on horseback, looser in some way I couldn't name. His posture less like armor and more like something that simply belonged outdoors. Once, when my horse had shied at a crossing, his hand had come out automatically and caught my reins, steadying, and then released just as automatically. And he had not looked at me afterward, and I had not looked at him. And we had ridden the next mile in a silence that was so full it took genuine effort to breathe through. Rail rode behind us. I caught his expression once, reflected briefly in a stream crossing, carefully, deliberately neutral, and nearly laughed. The garrison's commander, a weathered woman named Petra, met us at the gates. She had the efficient warmth of someone who respected competence above all other qualities and was still making up her mind about me specifically. She showed us to the summit quarters, a connected set of rooms at the garrison's northern end, smaller than Ironhold's chambers but well kept, smelling of cedar and dried herbs. 1 bedroom. I stood in the doorway and looked at the single bed, and then at Rail, who had the expression of a man who had known about this, and spent the journey here deciding how to mention it. Summit protocol, he said carefully. Lord Cadman's people arranged the quarters. They wanted to ensure the sleeping arrangements were consistent with a real marriage, I finished. Yes. I looked at Cassian. He was standing at the room's small window, looking out at the ridge, and when he turned his expression was unreadable, but his jaw was set in the way I had learned meant he was thinking hard about something he hadn't yet decided. I'll take the floor, he said. You absolutely will not, I said, and surprised us both with the firmness of it. Kedman's people will have ears everywhere. If anyone hears you on the floor... I stopped, steadied myself. We share the bed. There's enough room. We've managed a settee. Something moved through his eyes. Penny. Parameters, I said, and almost smiled. Follow my lead. That was on your list. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned back to the window. All right. Lord Cadman arrived the next morning. He was not what I had built in my imagination. I had expected something overtly threatening, sharp-edged and cold. What I found instead was a man of deliberate pleasantness, somewhere in his 60s, with a smile that reached most of the way to his eyes and stopped just short. He shook Cassian's arm in the traditional greeting, commented graciously on the border garrison's upkeep, and then turned to me with the specific attentiveness of someone who has saved their real assessment for last. "Lady Penny," he said, "we've heard a great deal about the Alpha King's bride." "I hope some of it was useful," I said pleasantly. He laughed, a real one, or close enough to real that it didn't matter. Beside me, I felt Cassian's attention shift toward me with that warm, particular quality I had first noticed in the East study during our evenings of practice, and I understood suddenly that he wasn't performing it. The attention was simply there, the way a compass needle is simply there, pointing without effort or decision. I was aware of him the way you are aware of fire in a cold room. The first day of the summit was formal. Border trade figures, garrison resource allocation, the renegotiation of passage rights along the northern ridge. I sat beside Cassian at the long table and said almost nothing, because the topics were his domain, and my role was presence rather than contribution. But I listened, and I watched, and by midday, I had understood 3 things about Lord Cadman that I was fairly certain Cassian hadn't noticed yet. 1. Cadman deferred every concrete commitment to a younger man seated behind him, narrow-faced, watchful, who wrote everything down and occasionally leaned forward to murmur something in Kedman's ear. Not an aide, something with more authority than that. 2. Every time Cassian referenced the Eastern Alliance, the treaty that connected Ironhold to 3 outer pacts including Thornvale, Cadman's smile thinned by precisely the amount a smile thins when someone mentions something they intended to dismantle. 3. During the midday break, when Kedman's party gathered in the courtyard and didn't know I was behind the open window of the corridor above, I heard the narrow-faced man say, "The girl is convincing, but she's an Omega from the border. 2 months, and she hasn't made a single political move. It's arrangement, not alliance. Push on Thornvale's clause at the evening reception." I stood very still until they moved away. Then I went to find Cassian. He was in a side room off the main hall with Rael and Petra, going over the afternoon's agenda, and he looked up when I appeared in the doorway with an expression that sharpened immediately at whatever he saw on my face. "Give us a moment," he said to Rael and Petra. They filed out. I closed the door and told him everything I had heard, precisely and without embellishment, and watched him absorb it with that still, contained focus that I had stopped finding intimidating sometime in the last 3 weeks. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Thornvale Clause covers military aid distribution to 4 Eastern pacts. If Cadman moves to restructure it, Thornvale loses its protection corridor," I said, "and so do the 3 pacts beside it. Effectively, he cuts your Eastern network without technically violating the summit agreement." He looked at me. "You understood all that from 6 hours of trade figures." "I managed supply records for 6 years," I said. "Resource allocation is resource allocation." The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile I had learned to watch for without meaning to learn to watch for. "What do you suggest?" "Let me speak at the evening reception, not formally, informally to Kedman's people, the way wives do at receptions, the way everyone underestimates." I held his gaze. "Kedman's man thinks I haven't made any political moves. Let him keep thinking that while I make one." Cassian studied me for a long moment. Outside, wind moved across the ridge and pressed against the walls. In the filtered afternoon light, his blue eyes were the color of a sky deciding its own weather. "All right," he said, for the 3rd time in as many days. But this time, it sounded different. Not like agreement, not like permission, but like trust. The kind that isn't given lightly and knows it. The evening reception was held in the garrison's main hall, torches lit and tables arranged, the smell of pine and roasted pine nuts, and mulled something warm drifting through the crowded room. I wore the deep blue dress Mara had sent with us. "You'll need something that isn't gray," she had said, with the practicality of someone who understood that appearance was information. And I moved through the room the way I had always moved through rooms like this, quietly, attentively, as if I were simply there to observe. Cadman's narrow-faced man, I had learned his name was Sovin, found me by the fire as I'd expected. He had that particular ease of someone who had dismissed you already and was simply being polite about it. I talked to him about the Eastern Territories for 20 minutes, about supply lines and crop yields and the specific vulnerabilities of packs that had lost garrison support over the previous decade. I did it gently, conversationally, the way you tell someone a story they don't realize is about them until the last line. By the end of it, Sovin had gone very still. The Thornvale Clause as written protects not just Thornvale, but the entire Eastern network, I said pleasantly, setting down my cup. Anyone who restructures it will find that the Eastern Pacts, all 4 of them, have grounds to invoke the broader Alliance Treaty, which would require Lord Cadman's territory to compensate 3 years of lost protection. I checked the figures this afternoon. It's not a small number. I smiled at him. I just thought someone should mention it. I turned and walked back across the hall. Cassian was standing near the far wall, and I didn't know how long he had been watching, but his eyes found mine the moment I turned, and across the noise and warmth and crowded press of the reception, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not assessment, not the cataloging attention. Something that was open in a way I suspected very few people had ever seen on that face. I crossed the room to him and stopped at his side, close enough that our arms nearly touched, and he leaned down, just slightly, just enough, and said very quietly, near my ear, "You didn't need the practice." "I practiced anyway," I said. "It turned out to be useful for other things." He didn't ask what other things. He already knew. And when his hand found mine in the space between us, not for the room, not for Cadman, not for any parameter on any list, I let it stay there, and neither of us said a word. And the wall between practice and real didn't just crack this time. It came all the way down. We rode back to Ironhold Keep in a different kind of silence than the one we'd left with. The journey out had been 2 people performing proximity, hyper-aware of every accidental contact, every breath that landed too close. The journey back was something else entirely. The silence of 2 people who have stopped pretending and haven't yet found the words for what replaced the pretense. Cassian rode beside me the way he always had, unhurried, contained. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted. Something had been put down. I couldn't have named it precisely, but I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Not the weather itself, but the certain knowledge that it's coming. Rail, to his considerable credit, said absolutely nothing. We arrived at the keep as evening was settling, the torches in the courtyard already lit, the familiar smell of pine resin and cold iron wrapping around me like something I hadn't expected to recognize as comfort but did. Mara was waiting in the entrance hall. Not officially, she would have said if asked. She simply happened to be passing through with an armful of ledgers at the precise moment we walked in, which fooled no one. She looked at my face, and then at Cassian's, and then back at mine, and the small, satisfied compression of her lips said everything she was too discreet to speak aloud. That night, for the first time since my arrival at Ironhold, I did not throw the bolt on the connecting door. I didn't open it. I simply didn't lock it. It was a small thing, technically. In practice, it felt enormous, the way small things do when they carry the weight of everything that came before them. I lay in the dark and listened to the keep breathe around me and thought about Cadman's summit, about Sovin's careful stillness when he realized I'd outmaneuvered him, about Cassian's hand finding mine in the reception hall with no audience to perform for. I thought about Mara saying he sealed everything off and became what you see now. I thought about a man who left the light on and couldn't sleep. Sometime past midnight, I heard the familiar sound through the connecting door. The quiet movement, the restless pacing, the creak of the desk chair. I lay still for a while listening. Then I got up, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and knocked. Not the door to the corridor, the connecting door. The movement on the other side stopped. A long pause. Then, "Come in." He was at his desk, not working. There was nothing in his hands, no map or dispatch or letter. He had simply been sitting in the lamp's small circle of light in the dark room, and he looked at me when I opened the door with an expression that was so unguarded it almost stopped me in the threshold. Like I had walked in on something private, something he hadn't had time to rearrange before I saw it. I had. I knew that. I didn't look away. "You can't sleep either," I said. "I rarely can." He watched me cross the room and settle into the chair near the window, pulling the blanket tighter. "You should rest. The council review is tomorrow morning." "I know." I looked out at the dark courtyard below, the banked torches, the quiet keep. "Tell me about Aaron." The silence that followed was the longest one he'd ever given me. I counted my own heartbeats in it. "Mara told you," he said finally. "Not an accusation." "Yes." Another pause. "What did she tell you?" "That she was taken. That you looked for her and couldn't find her. That you sealed things off after." He was quiet for a moment. In the lamp's light, the scar along his jaw was very visible, and I wondered for the first time, with the particular certainty of a thought arriving fully formed, that the scar and Aaron's disappearance were not separate stories. "I was 26, he said. "She was bonded to me by the old rights. Not an arrangement, a real bond. The Valen faction used her to get to me. To show me that the title meant nothing if I couldn't protect the people closest to me." He looked at his hands on the desk. "They were right." "They were not right," I said, quietly but without softness, because softness would have let him keep the story the way he'd shaped it, and I didn't think that story was serving him anymore. "They were cruel. Those are different things." He looked at me. "You were 26, I said. "You were new to the throne, and you were targeted specifically because you loved someone. That's not a failure of protection. That's someone else's crime." The lamp flickered. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and went quiet. "I've ruled for 11 years since then," he said slowly. "I've built this territory into something that can't be threatened that easily again. I've made alliances and enforced borders and done everything that needed doing." He paused. "I just stopped being a person while I was doing it." "I noticed," I said, and the honesty of it landed between us, clean and without cruelty. He almost smiled. This time it reached further than usual. Not a full smile, not the kind that takes over a face, but something real and slightly unsteady, like something that hadn't been used in a long time and needed a moment to remember how. "You notice most things," he said. "I'm quiet," I said. "Quiet people notice more than anyone thinks." He was looking at me with that open expression again, the one I'd first seen across the reception hall, and I understood now what it was. It was the expression of someone who had been alone for a very long time. Not alone in the sense of without company. He had Rael and Mara and 47 council wolves, but alone in the sense of unseen, and he was not used to being seen. He had arranged his life so that no one could see him deeply enough to find the places that were still unhealed, and I had come in quietly, with supply records and gray cloaks and no particular ambition, and somehow seen him anyway. "Penny," he said, and the way he said my name, just that, just those 2 syllables in the dark, was nothing like practice and everything like the real thing. "I know," I said. The council review the next morning was the last formal hurdle. Lord Fenwick had received word of the summit's outcome before we did, which meant he arrived at the table with his recalculation already finished and his opposition substantially revised. He said nothing overt. He didn't need to. The shift was visible in the way he positioned himself, no longer angled away from me, slightly toward, the body language of a man who has updated his assessment and is too proud to announce it, but not so proud as to keep fighting a position he's already abandoned. Cassian presented the summit results. Keedman's restructuring attempt abandoned. The Eastern Alliance intact. The Thornvale Clause not only preserved but quietly reinforced by language Soven had agreed to in the aftermath of our reception hall conversation, when the alternative had become mathematically unappealing. Fenwick looked at me. The Eastern network strengthened, he said carefully. That was your doing? It was a joint effort, I said. Fenwick held my gaze for a moment. Then he did something I had not seen him do in any meeting I had sat through. He inclined his head, small, controlled, but genuine. Rael, seated to my left, was extremely busy studying the table's surface. The formal arrangement had specified 1 year. We never renegotiated it out loud. We didn't need to. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent than any contract. A gradual filling in of all the spaces the fake marriage had left deliberately empty. Cassian began appearing at the archive in the late mornings, standing at the doorway in that way he had, until Mara handed him a ledger with the pointed efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this, and told him to make himself useful. He did. He was, it turned out, meticulous in the way that archivists dream about, and he had detailed knowledge of territorial history that filled gaps in the records no one had been able to explain. He started sleeping better. I knew because the midnight pacing stopped, and Rael mentioned it in the corridor one afternoon, with the badly suppressed satisfaction of a man whose king was, for the first time in recent memory, appearing at morning briefings without shadows under his eyes. Mara said nothing about any of it, which was her particular way of saying everything. 3 months after the summit, Cassian stood at the window of the East Study, our East Study now, by simple habit and unspoken agreement, and watched the first snow of the season settle over the courtyard, and said, without turning, I want to formally petition the council to convert the alliance marriage to a permanent bond. I set down the cup I was holding. That's not a convenient arrangement, I said. That's real. Yes, he said. He turned then, blue eyes steady and certain in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or political calculation. I'm aware. I thought about Elder Doran calling me sensible and quiet and safe, meaning small. I thought about every room I had been invisible in, every table where my comfort had been the last consideration. I thought about a gray cloak and a supply ledger, and a woman who had signed a contract at midnight by candlelight, telling herself it was simple. Nothing about this had ever been simple. Yes, I said. The bonding ceremony was held in Ironhold's great hall on the first clear morning after the snow, the light coming through the high windows in long cold bars, the stone walls lined with every wolf of the territory. Rael stood at Cassian's right with the expression of a man trying very hard not to look as emotional as he was. Mara stood near the front with ink-stained fingers and no expression at all, which was precisely how Mara looked when something mattered deeply to her. Petra had ridden 2 days from the border garrison to be present. She stood in the back, arms folded, and nodded once when I caught her eye. Fenwick was in the front row. He stood straight and still through the entire ceremony, and at the end, when the rites were spoken and the bond was made, he was the first of the council to lower his head in the formal gesture of recognition. After everyone else, after the hall had filled and then quieted, after the words that made everything official and permanent, and finally real, Cassian took both my hands in his blue eyes very close, and said quietly enough that only I could hear, I looked at you at the bottom of those stairs and I thought, she isn't what I expected. I'm not what anyone expects, I said. No, he agreed, and the almost smile reached all the way this time, full and unhurried, and entirely his. That's the point. I had arrived at Ironhold Keep as a convenience. A quiet woman in a gray cloak, with no remarkable qualities, and no particular ambitions, useful precisely because she would not complicate things. I left that version of myself in the East Study sometime around midnight, on the night I knocked on a connecting door I hadn't locked, and I did not go back for her. The woman who remained was still quiet, still observant, still the kind of person who noticed things from the edges of rooms and filed them carefully away. But she was also the woman who had held a council without flinching, outmaneuvered a lord's political architect over a reception hall cup, and walked through a door that didn't lock anymore because she had decided, finally, that she was done making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of simple. Cassian had spent 11 years becoming a wall. I had spent 23 becoming invisible. We were, it turned out, exactly what the other one needed. Not to be saved, not to be fixed, but to be seen. Clearly, completely, without the performance or the distance or the careful list of parameters. The contract said convenience. It said temporary. It said no emotional entanglements. We kept none of those terms, and the snow kept falling over Ironhold's courtyard, soft and steady, and without apology, covering everything that had come before in clean white silence. And inside the keep, in a study full of maps and books and the smell of cedar and cold, two people who had built their lives around walls sat together in the firelight, and the walls were gone. And neither of them was alone anymore. That was the end of the fake marriage. It was also, in every way that mattered, the beginning of everything else.